Cool.
All right.
You are? All right. So welcome to Northeast Comic-Con and Collectors Fest. This is our first panel of the morning. I'm Mike, so I'll be me and Patrick. Patrick's in the other room. We're going to be flip-flopping. We've got a lot of great panels for you guys to check out today. So certainly check the schedule and check on over here. So for the first panel we're going to do, it's called Riverdale and Back Again. For you Archie fans, Riverdale's an important place. And who we're going to be talking with today is Dan Parent, who is an amazing artist, writer, and he really has the feel. I guess you are the main classic Archie guy at this point, right?
Well, stick around long enough. You survive all the other artists. I've been there 35 years, so yes, I'm the Archie guy now.
Awesome. So 35 years, and that's perfect you said that. When I started reading Archie comics, probably around like 25, 30 years ago, I was reading your stuff. How did you, or even Archie, how did you get interested in comic book art in general?
I was a huge comic book fan growing up. I started out with Harvey comics, Big Girl Richie, Casper, and all those books. And I was probably 5 years old. And then just my mom bought me a bunch of comics, and I remember there was like a Josie comic mixed in there, which is an Archie title, and I just became hooked on comics at that point. Maybe when I was like 7 or 8 years old, I started getting into like the superhero comics, I started reading everything at that point, but I still kept collecting the Archies. It was something that kept drawing me always back to the Archies. And then still continued to collect comics for high school, and then I went to art school. After I graduated high school, I went to the Joe Kubert School, which anybody who knows comics knows it's like a really pretty popular school for a lot of people that want to get into comics. A lot of my colleagues and a lot of artists that you know have gone to Kubert School. It was a great place to go, and then I lucked out because when I was going to Kubert School, Archie comics would come down and they would look at people's portfolios. And I, of course, being an Archie fan, had some Archie sample pages, and didn't get hired the first time they came. I was like a sophomore, or my second year of school, and didn't get hired then. But in my third year, they came and looked at my stuff, and I was better then. So they started me for Archie pages. So I actually got hired in my third year at Kubert School. And when I graduated, they hired me full time. So it was a nice, Kubert School is a really good stepping stone for me, for my career.
Now you mentioned the Josie comics, right? So Josie, for people who don't know, Josie and the Pussycats, and before there was a Pussycats, there was Chief Josie,
right?
Which was a book that was out, and Dan DeCarlo, who created Josie, based it off his wife. So and then in the 60s they became hip and cool.
Right. Well, what happened was Josie was a pretty popular Archie title, and then the Archie Saturday morning cartoon came on, which was huge. That's when they had the hit Sugar Sugar. It was like a really big nationwide hit. Cartoon was really popular. Then, of course, Saturday morning TV was like, you want another Archie type of show. So they said, let's do an all-girl group with Josie and the Pussycats. So that's when the Josie comic book became Josie and the Pussycats, and then translated into the Saturday morning show, which was really popular for a long time. Yeah, so.
History changed with that. So the reason I mentioned Josie and Dan DeCarlo, I'm going to just ask, is a lot of your style really based off of where you drew a lot of your inspiration from in your art?
Yeah, Dan was always a real inspiration, even before we knew Dan's name, because in the old days they never gave credits in comic books. You'd have to look at the books and you'd be like, I don't know who this artist is, but he's like the best Archie artist. So when you see like Dan DeCarlo covers, you'd be like, oh, it's that artist again. He's really good. I don't know his name. And then in the late 70s, early 80s, they started getting credit. Then I knew who Dan DeCarlo was. And then I knew who Stan Goldberg was, and Dexter Taylor. There was like a whole series of artists, and Stan Schwartz. There was always some really good artists, but for me, Dan was my favorite. So he was always kind of the style I sort of emulated when I was trying to draw Archie.
And I would say with Dan, he really is the one that, because I mean, if you look back at the early Archie from like the 40s, right? Like he's got like the bucktooth, and it's a much different Archie in the game that we know now. And Dan kind of really created that, at least till new stuff like Riverdale and everything. But he really created that classic Archie style that most of the artists gravitate to now.
Right. He kind of made them look really like pretty. Like he kind of made everybody, he gave everybody sort of the typical Archie style. Especially with Betty and Veronica, it's like that style for them. So I think like, in the mid to late 50s, when the Dan DeCarlo style started to like take over.
Pin-up style.
Right. Then by the 60s, the Dan DeCarlo style was like the style they went for. And was pretty much that set the standard. After that, everybody, whenever they hire people, they'd always be like, draw like Dan DeCarlo. That's what we want you to do. Do you feel like Dan DeCarlo? So,
And
it's kind of a huge feat to try and do that, but
I mean, like you mentioned, like, and especially his covers, like they really stood out. If you look at it, like really, like the books from, I'd say even like the 70s into the 80s, like those 2 decades, like the beach covers, like I remember all that stuff. The one quick gag and Archie and the gang around on the beach.
Those are always the best-selling covers of the beach covers. They always told us that the Betty and Veronica swimsuit covers are always the best sellers, and the summertime is when the sales are always the best. And I guess the other exception was Christmas. It's always a big seller too.
Well, the one thing you mentioned summertime. Growing up as well, I used to go to summer camp, and I worked at a summer camp. A lot of kids take the digest.
Oh yeah,
it's a camp. That's a huge thing.
Yeah, we saw a lot of digest in the summer for that reason. We'll travel with them. And so the digests are still our biggest selling books. You see them everywhere. They're still like keeps Archie plugging along. And it's funny, as far as other good selling things, like now suddenly Halloween is like really big selling thing too. It never was like the last 10 years, but now Halloween seems to have catapulted into that category of. So I guess Halloween is a big commercial holiday, bigger than I guess.
Well, and you mentioned Christmas too. Making another Dan DeCarlo, I guess, staple Christmas-wise, and I know you've done it in the books that you've done. Jingles.
Oh, Jingles, yeah.
He pops up every year.
Yeah, Jingles is the elf who visits from the North Pole. He's like and then there's a Sugar Plum, who's like the little the female elf who comes around. And since then, we've even created a few more characters. I came up with this character, Santa's daughter, who visits Betty and Veronica because she's like a teenager who wants to kind of get away from the North Pole. So I've done a few stories with her. So we can do all this. We can think of anything we want.
It all applies in the world of Riverdale.
Right.
So now let me ask. So you said third year at Hubert School. You got picked up by Archie at that point. What were some of the first assignments? What was that like getting into coming into Archie? Because I'd say probably around that time Archie was a mainstay, bigger company as well. So what did they have you working on as an entry level artisan?
Well, when you start out, you do like a lot of one-pagers, like single-page gags, like simple things. But when I started there, I actually I was going to be a freelance artist, and then there was an artist that worked in the art department who had to quit because this is the reason. They had a cat in the office up at Archie, and he was allergic to cats. So instead of getting rid of the cat, they got rid of him. But he went freelance. He was fine. He was just looking for employees. So I wasn't allergic to cats, and I would have applied anyway. So I got his spot in the art department, and but right away I started working on licensing. Right around that time, in the late '80s, there was the new Archie, which is another one of the 100 shows that's been on the air. And I think, kind of justifiably so. It wasn't that good, but there was a lot of licensing going on at that time. So I kind of went right into doing a lot of licensing, which was really cool. I learned a lot because this is also pre-digital age. Like this is like 1987. 5 or 6 more years later, when everything digital started with Photoshop and stuff. But I just barely missed that. So I was still doing like design and mechanicals the old-fashioned way by hand. So, but I was doing a lot of that stuff and doing the comics. So I was working full time in the office, and then going home at night and drawing the comics. So I was kind of working like 80, 100 hours a week. It was crazy, but at that point you're hungry and desperate to get in the business, so you are loving it.
Now let me ask you too, because around that period too, the late '80s, early '90s, you mentioned the new Archie, and it's a forgotten show. And actually, that was kind of like my gateway drug into the world
Yeah.
Archie, because I watched the cartoon on Saturday mornings,
Right.
and then I would buy the comics. Cool, I'm going to give Teenage Archie a try, and then instantly got hooked. Around that time period, they started being a little creative. With the Archie books.
Yeah.
You know, they did titles like Facts and Funnies, Children's Strange Science,
Yeah.
Hot Dog,
yeah.
But you had a book that came out which was like really off the wall, Jughead's Diner.
Right.
What was the evolution of that? Because that even took Jughead out of
Right.
the world of
Right. Well, Jughead's Diner, again, this is a time where like they were saying, we just want some new books. So me and a couple other of my colleagues, we created like 8 titles in a very short time. Most of them did not last that long.
not even 8 issues.
Right, right. I think like we did the only one that really lasted a long time was we did a Veronica book, her first solo book, and that lasted for like 20 years. So that her solo title that continued on, but the other ones were just fun experiments. Jughead's Diner was my favorite because it was basically it was slightly inspired by Pee-wee's Playhouse because Pee-wee's Playhouse was just this wacky show, you know. So this is sort of Jughead in his own world, kind of like his version of Pee-wee's Playhouse. But we had to take him out of Riverdale. So basically, he just driving down the road on a stormy night, finds an old abandoned diner, and it just transports him into this wacky world that's like everything's diners and food and you know Jughead-ish. And yeah, if you read the book, you'd think we were on hard drugs or something, but we weren't. We just were having a lot of fun. And yeah, that was, they let us go crazy.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. They gave you the creative license. You know, keep Jughead true, but just be wacky.
Yeah, they just do our thing, yeah. Yeah. The other title we did, we did a book called Archie 3000, obviously set in the future. That lasted around 20 issues. That lasted through 3 years, but yeah. And then of course the 90s was settling in, and there was sort of a recession, and so there was sort of like, and they sort of had to like cut back to like more of the 4 titles after that.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the world of Archie too. Is I mean the core Archie gang is always there. But, you know, you just watch the cycles. I mean, certainly the TV show for Sabrina helped that Sabrina.
Sure.
Because Sabrina, and even Josie to some extent, you know, when I started collecting Archie books, they lived as like 5-7 page stories in time.
Right.
You know, they never really had their own books. Back in the 60s and 70s, they had their own. So it's interesting to see how, so like a roller coaster, how those characters come and go.
Right, well, like when the Sabrina show started in the 90s, the Melissa Joan Hart sitcom, that spurred a lot more interest in Sabrina. Then when that show went off, then they did like a manga version of Sabrina.
And an animated series as well.
Then there was an animated series, because that took over the format of the book for a while too. And then there was just whatever kind of, whatever they could get going, you know, like Archie's Weird Mysteries came around 2000. That was a series for a few years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they just sort of, you know, kept going until, you know, then we kind of had Riverdale come along years later. It was just now the big thing right now.
And you know, it's interesting, like with Riverdale in particular, you know, you have people, and I mean, we're talking even grandparents who read Archie comics, who are now watching it with their teenage grandkids.
Right.
And you see, like everybody kind of had, like I mentioned, new Archies, everybody had like their gateway drug, whether they were just picking up on the newsstand 70, 80 years ago, watching the 70s cartoons of Archie or Sabrina or Josie, and the new Archies, and then Weird Mysteries. I know like that was like a huge show, and like Paul Castiglia, who I've talked to about this before too, who wrote the comic book version of it, and Fernando did the art for that.
Fernando did, yeah.
Like, I don't even think in the Archie offices they realized, like in syndication, how huge the show was.
I mean, the show wasn't on for that long,
Yeah.
but they kept rerunning those over and over, and I know in Canada it was hugely popular.
Yeah.
And it did really well on video too, like so even nowadays people will come up to me and they'll bring copies of Archie Weird Mysteries. It's just really one of those books that's really like held up over.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then now Riverdale.
Right.
Is the thing. But before we even talk about Riverdale, let's talk about some of the characters you created. You mentioned the Veronica book,
Right.
which lasted for like 20 years. And in the Veronica book, as you guys all know the character Kevin Keller. Dan created Kevin, and
Right.
he first showed up in
Veronica.
Veronica.
Right.
So let's just talk a little bit about the creation of Kevin.
Right.
He was a big addition to the book.
He was. This is around 2010, where Archie, we're at a point where we're like, we had new ownership of the company. We're like, we need to add some characters, add some diversity to Archie. So we were starting to do that. We were adding, more characters, and then I was like, well, we need a gay character. And then John was like John Goldwater, who owns the company, was like, yeah, I don't see why not. There's not a good reason to not do it. So we introduced Kevin in an issue of Veronica, and just test the waters, and people loved the character. And then when Riverdale came around, Kevin became a part of the Riverdale show. And so now Kevin is just part of the fabric of Riverdale. Everyone, acknowledges that Kevin's there. It was a little controversial at first because some conservative groups that weren't happy about it, but they have done other things to complain about, and everything's good. Everything is good. So, but yeah. So then, then in the last 10 years too, because of Riverdale, Archie just seems to have like a lot more. I don't know. It's recognized for its diversity now, which Archie never really was before. It's funny when the kids that watch Riverdale, don't even know it's based on a comic book.
Yeah.
So we see kids coming in, like ordering the old Archie trades and stuff, because they want to read what Riverdale is based on. So it all was that.
Well, and it's funny, like and whichever way you're entering into the world of Archie or Riverdale, if you're a teenager who never read an Archie before, you're in for a surprise when it's nice. But if you're a Archie comics fan going into the world of Riverdale, it's like,
hold on tight.
You mentioned the diversity of characters, and I know you did Clash of the New Kids with Alex.
Right.
There's a whole cast of characters in that. But there's been some other characters that you've introduced over the last few years too. Kevin obviously stuck around. Are there some other characters that you're really proud of that you created? Other characters that you wish would have stuck around more?
There are characters that just kind of surprisingly did well. There's one character called Harper who I introduced, and she's Veronica's cousin. And she's based on a real person. There's a girl named Jewel in Canada, and she was this children's author. She was in a wheelchair. She couldn't walk, but she reminded me of Veronica. Veronica in a wheelchair. That's the way I could describe it. She didn't let that kind of define her, and so I just based her as the character of Harper, and in the comic book made her Veronica's cousin, and so she just took off because I think she was a unique character. And again, she happened to be handicapped, but it wasn't it wasn't the main crux of the story. People just liked her personality because she was very vain and bossy like Veronica, and she was a good foil for Veronica. And then, there's been a couple other characters, like Ginger Lopez is pretty popular.
Again, if you're watching the shows, Ginger Lopez from comic book is not different. Ginger Lopez
is completely different, yes. And then we did Clash of the New Kids. We introduced, it was basically two schools, another school merging with Riverdale High. We brought in 20 or 30 new students. And then some of them clicked, some of them are long forgotten, but we just kind of did it as a fun experiment. And then there's the Archie Valerie romance, which took off, which Valerie is an existing character. She's one of Josie and the Pussycats. But the romance between Archie and Valerie just took off because it just felt natural. When I was writing it, it was supposed to be Archie and Josie, and that didn't feel that natural. They just seemed kind of boring together, Archie and Josie. But
two redheads, two band leaders.
It seems a little repetitive. But Valerie was always the smart, edgy one of the Pussycats, and it just gave her a good contrast with Archie. And that was the easiest story I ever wrote because it just made sense.
And again, another story that kind of makes some headlines.
It did. And then they also used the storyline for a while in Riverdale too. So.
And it's funny because I work in a school, and I have some of the trades in my classrooms in my offices, and the kids, I have the Josie and Archie Great. And some of the kids see the cover of that, like, oh my God, what's going on there?
Yeah.
No, it's not. It's like they're kissing annoying.
Yeah, the raining, there's like a sexy cover, yeah.
And then classic characters. I mean, you mentioned all these new characters you created. Who would you say is maybe your favorite classic character? Are there any classic characters that you haven't seen in a while? Yeah.
I mean, I always loved Little Archie, and I always thought they don't do enough with Little Archie, because the classic Little Archie stuff is so good. It's so funny and well written that, especially the Bob Bowling stuff. But the Dexter Taylor stuff, we did it many years after Bob Bowling, is still really good too. It doesn't get enough attention. And then there's some classic characters like Cosmo the Martian is a fun character. But I love all the characters. Jughead is always probably the most consistently great character because it's just Jughead. He's just everyone loves Jughead. He's a go-to character. If you want to do a funny story, you go to Jughead. So there's so many quality characters. Reggie sometimes gets the short shrift because he's also a really good character. He was more popular years ago when he had his own book, but sometimes the bad guys get pushed back a little bit.
Because, and you mentioned he seems like one of those characters that you don't see as often anymore. Even like on Riverdale, he's there, but he's not one of the main characters.
Yeah, in Riverdale, he's not quite the main main five characters anymore. But Reggie's, they all, even like characters like Gilpin and stuff, they're really, they're really good supporting characters. At Big Ethel, which now she's just Ethel. They call her Big Ethel anymore for some reason. Tall Ethel, yeah. So.
No, that's great. Folks out there, do you have any questions about Archie? And what do you guys like about Archie comics or Riverdale? It's all the same, kind of the same world. And you got to visit the set of Riverdale. What was that like?
It was cool. I was up in Vancouver at a convention, so I got to visit the set, and it was great. The cast was wonderful. I think it's a really good cast. Fun watching them film the show. It was a really fun experience.
Because you have pictures. What was it like walking into Pops?
That was cool because I was alone in there. Because I had to kind of hang out on the set while that stuff was going on.
Yeah.
And then Pops wasn't being used. So I just went into Pops and I was like taking pictures of selfies with myself and Pops. And it's actually like, even though a lot of the show is sets, the Pops is actually a self-contained diner. It's like an actual full diner that you can go into. Where like the roof is just soft for like the cameras and stuff. So it's really cool, yeah. So I was in there. It's cool. It was like even like cake and muffins that they would bring in and put them on these little what do you call those little cake plates things? So I was like tempted to like take stuff, but I didn't.
It was very surreal, I'm sure.
It was cool. It was fun. It was being an Archie fan, myself, and working for Archie, it's weird seeing it come to life like that.
And I know doing all these conventions and stuff too, you've gotten to meet some of the cast. I know being on the set. How has that been for you to see these people who are bringing these characters that you work with, but even with them? Like, have they come up and asked questions about like, oh?
Yeah. I mean, the first one I met was I forget one who plays Cheryl. Madeline. Her name. She's really cool, and sometimes they would come to me at a show and they'll be like, so "You're the guy who draws the comics that we're based on," and everyone I've met from the show has been super sweet, super nice, some of the people who have been working on the show didn't even know what Archie Comics was before they got on the show. So.
Again, opening up new doors.
Yeah.
I mean, and especially like just going on with the Riverdale thing. I think the first season, I don't think they do it so much anymore. There were a lot of like really, obviously, the Valerie Archie romance. My friend Alex Simmons is like they did a little thing where like Jughead almost being like the detective kind of thing, like Alex did a thing on that. One of my favorite jokes, they had Josie in a Pussycat performing on days or like something for school. And the drum had the classic logo on it.
Right.
And I think Kevin introduced them. And he said something like longer years.
Oh, yeah.
Or something, from the song.
Right, yeah.
So I think they steered away from that. But it was,
Well, they had a dream sequence once too, where like the characters were all dressed like themselves back in the 50s
Yes.
too, from the comic books. It's cool. That's because Roberto, who writes the show, is such a huge Archie fan that he always makes sure little bits and pieces of the comic book world are getting into the show somehow.
well, and it's the history, and even at the end of the show, like you see the classic Archie
Right.
morph into
Right.
modern Archie.
Right.
So,
Right.
another thing I wanted to talk about too, so you do Archie comics, but you and Fernando, Luis, who is another Archie artist,
Right.
do another series called Die Kitty Die.
Yes.
How did that come about? How did you work together at Archie to that?
Well, Die Kitty Die is something that Fernando Ruiz, another colleague of mine at Archie, we decided to do a Kickstarter to launch our own book. And this is sort of the storyline where it's a little edgier than Archie, it's a little more satirical, it basically makes fun of the comic book industry a little bit. And even though it's still in the Archie style, it's a little off from the Archie style intentionally. And the premise of the book is basically Kitty is a comic book character. She's been around for many years, and her sales are flat. They don't know what they're going to do, and they decide that they're going to kill her off to boost sales. But in this setting, Kitty is like a real character amongst the real people, and it's kind of like Roger Rabbit, where like the characters are real amongst society. So they have to kind of hire other cartoon characters in their comic book universe to try and kill her off. So it becomes sort of like that's like the running joke is they got to kill Kitty. How we've been able to do 4 series now, Die Kitty Die. There's always like a death angle in there somehow. So far we've been able to keep it up. So.
And you the mix it up.
Yeah. We create sort of our own characters, and we create what kind of parodies, comedy characters, heroes. And we've created our own universe of Kitty comics, and we just create it as we go along, make up this history as we go along. So it's a very open story. It's basically what we want. And that was the point of it. Wanting to just do a comic series that was fun, sort of based on the comics we grew up on, with a little bit of a twist, kind of having fun with it. So
And like even the most recent iteration of it, before, perhaps.
right, we just decided to do Kitty by Kitty Die Starstruck, where it's set in outer space. But I wanted to do it in outer space.
Now, let me ask you too. You and Fernando have been doing conventions for many years prior to doing Kitty, and certainly for all you folks out here, if you're Archie fans, if you're Comic-Con fans, I mean, it's kind of this whole world is in Kitty, like the whole Comic-Con culture. I was going to ask, like, how much of what do you take away from being at these kinds of events that maybe you pull into Kitty stories?
Well, we in the stories we actually have Kitty going to comic conventions and meeting fans, and even trying to sabotage her at her conventions. So we definitely everything that happens to us in real life or in the comic book world, we know it's places in the Kitty world somewhere. So it's just fun. Again, we've done 4 Kickstarters. Each one has done better than the previous one, and then we get published afterwards. If you have been in comic shops, so after we do the Kickstarters, we get published by Chapter House, the company that publishes us, and it's just a great creative outlet to just do something really out there.
And you guys, I'm assuming, have a 5th Kickstarter that will be starting at some point.
Yeah, we're churning the ideas. We left the last one with a real cliffhanger, so we have to resolve that, obviously. So we have to think about how we're going to move on with that one. So Kitty finds herself in a perilous situation in the end. Once again. So.
And then in regards to the world of Archie, what's next for you with Archie? What's coming? I mean, they got the Riverdale show, but for classic Archie, what are you working on?
Well, I'm working on, right now, as we speak, I'm working on Christmas stories for this year. Starting to work on ideas for next year. And then pretty soon I'm going to be doing a Kickstarter for Archie. We're going to be doing a Kevin Keller Omnibus. It's going to be like a 700-page collection of everything of Kevin Keller. Everything has been printed up, Kevin has been printed in the book. So it's a big project. So that's why we're deciding to really meet Kickstarter it because I kind of came to them like I really want to do this omnibus. So they're letting me run it, which is going to be probably exciting and a nightmare at the same time because Kickstarter is going to be very daunting. But I'm excited to do it, and I think it's going to be over 700 pages. So it's going to be a really big book.
And it's Kevin Keller.
Everything is Kevin.
But classic-wise, not Riverdale.
Right, classic-wise. I think the only thing we're going to put in there is there is the In Life with Archie, which was the more realistic version of Archie. There was Kevin got married, and that was kind of a newsworthy story. So that story will be in there. But for the most part, it'll be just a classic. The Kevin series ran for about 18 issues, and then there was 4 issues of Veronica, and then there was random stories here and there that were appeared in the books. So it'll all talk in
George C.K.
story. There's the guest star, George C.K., and that will be in there. So yeah, it'll be fun, and so that probably will happen. I'm thinking August, probably.
So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. And other than that, we're just working on stuff for 2022 now. A couple new classic titles are going to happen. And then Archie's going to have I can't even talk about this, but Archie's going to have a big announcement in the middle of July about some new stuff that people will be really excited about.
I guess San Diego Comic-Con, probably.
Well, if there was a San Diego Comic-Con, but this year it's been kind of they're doing Comic-Con online, and the actual Comic-Con in San Diego is going to be Thanksgiving weekend.
Okay.
They safely moved it. I guess they didn't know the point where we would be with COVID back in the early winter, so they decided to play it safe.
Let me ask you a really silly question too.
Sure.
COVID, right? And there was a story that was taken around that, from a few years ago where they were all wearing masks. It must have been maybe done like in the 90s.
Oh, is that the one where Betty was online?
Well, there's that story too.
Yeah.
It was like in 2020 too, I think.
It was there was a story printed in 1997 where it's set in 2020, which is really strange.
Yeah.
And they're Betty story, and they're working from home. They're being schooled from home on their computers. So this is like pre-Zoom, pre-COVID. It just was a story that was very someone was reading it in a Betty book and noticed it, and then it became kind of viral online. And then Archie just reprinted it. I did a new book called Everything's Archie, which is like an 80th anniversary special book we did. I have it at the table too. And then that story, the story is included in there. At the last minute, when it was going to the printer, they were like, let's just throw this story in there. It's so timely. So it's a little bonus story. But the mask story.
There's another story. It was called maybe. It was somebody from Archie I follow online, where kids about getting cold.
Okay.
It wasn't anything near serious. I was talking about, but they're wearing masks. But I was going to ask, in the world of Archie, obviously they didn't. And again, we're moving forward. But has Archie said like, oh, we may address what went on in the world?
Not at all.
Again,
Nope.
Riverdale just passed over Riverdale.
They don't even want to address it because they think that COVID's enough of an annoyance that they don't even want to do anything with it. Like I did the only thing they let me do is I did like an Archie quarantine print where it's just like the counter is empty. There's just an empty soda. kind of sad actually, but I thought it was kind of funny. But they were fine with that. But they didn't want to do anything. But I had suggested it. Like they would use gags with like masks and stuff. But we could actually make some jokes about COVID.
And even everybody being at home doing homeschool.
Right. I mean, there are definitely things we could address with COVID, but they didn't want to even go there because I think Archie's an escape from COVID. They don't want to be part of it. Even on the Riverdale show, they decided to not acknowledge COVID at all on the show. They just figured, we're an escape.
No, that's good.
But I was tempted. Like, if they had given me the permission to do it, I definitely would have had fun with it.
There's definitely some places that be
Yeah.
there.
And it'll be interesting. We are like a time capsule thing, so it might be fun to look back 20 years from now, 30 years from now, like when COVID was a thing.
Yeah.
So.
Before we wrap up, does anybody else have any other questions for Dan about Archie, about Riverdale, anything like that? Kitty, yes, sir.
How are you?
Good.
That's good. Love Archie. Great stuff. I actually remember the big out for with Life with Archie where they killed off Archie.
Right.
That was phenomenal.
Yeah, yeah.
For a copy of that. The first question is Riverdale based Riverdale, New York, the Bronx?
That's always the big question. There's no real answer for that. Like, if you read the comics regularly, you know Riverdale is in a place where there's 4 seasons. You know it's got to be like in the northeast of somewhere in the northern part of the country. There's a beach. There are stories where they've been pretty close to New York City. So if I had to make my estimated guess, I would say Riverdale is in the northeast. But there was also like some kind of rumor or one time they were going to place Riverdale in the Midwest. But again, it wouldn't have made sense because there's no beaches in the Midwest. So we stay away from a definite answer. But in my mind, Riverdale is in like somewhere in New England. Because even when you go back to like Bob Montana, so we created Riverdale, like they're all from the New England area. So.
Oh man, I'm from Riverdale, New York.
Oh, you are? Okay, yeah. So close enough. It's close enough. I'd say, you're not far off. Sure.
Anybody else have any questions too about Riverdale, Archie? So, and it's funny that you mentioned Bob Montana. So up here in New England, and I forget the name of the town, but I mentioned Riverdale. They have an Archie statue.
Yeah, I went there last year and sat with it.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I think guys about the 4 seasons. Like obviously Riverdale near the Bronx. I mentioned the 4 seasons in the beach. I'm like, you think Riverdale be like,
Yeah.
because like they didn't have a coast there. It is one of those weird places, and it does have that very big western town. They have beaches.
No, it's definitely got to be northeast. It could even be out in the western part, but it just feels northeastern because of the way they get snow.
Yeah.
Nobody gets snow nobody gets the 4 seasons like New England.
Yeah.
Even up in like the Seattle area and stuff, they don't get a lot of that much snow up there. But like New England, you have 4 distinct seasons. That's why I vote for Riverdale is that it has to be.
And when you watch the Riverdale show, it does have that like New England.
Right.
Especially with all the occult stuff, I feel like it's the same.
I know.
So, well, cool. So yeah, folks, Dan, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Talking about Archie and Kitty and everybody. Go check out Dan's stable. He's doing missions, books, prints, everything that you can want Archie-wise. So if you're an Archie fan, go check it out and talk to Dan some more. And,
Thanks.
Thank you all for coming and joining us today.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.